times where Christian and I have talked about this, and he's put in a lot of time and effort. And like I said, when it comes to predicting election outcomes, these are the sort of things that he takes into consideration. So if you're wondering, as we go into this election cycle, if you are wondering, how are you going to combat this narrative, which will inevitably come? It is already starting, as you were about to see, that the only reason why Republicans won is because they cheated, right? Which I was told we're not allowed to say things like that. But apparently it's okay when the Democrats do it. Christian is about to give you all of the arguments that you need to be able to understand what is actually going on, what's been done, what's being done, and how it's going to affect the election cycle for 2022. Christian.
And for the next 10 years, actually.
Yeah, 10 years. 10 years.
Which kind of gets into, okay, so long story short, as most people know, every 10 years, there's a census that's done, right? So we just had one in 2020 that, determined the population of all the states and cities and counties and, everything in the country. Well, that census is used to then reappoint congressional seats to every single state in the country. There's 435 seats in the House of Representatives. We know there's 100 seats in the Senate because there's 50 states and there's 2 senators for every state. So in the House, it doesn't matter what happens with the state population. There's always 2 senators per state. That's enshrined in the Constitution. But the House is based on population, right? So every 10 years when the census is done and we re-update those numbers to figure out who's living where, those seats get reallocated to different states. So some states will lose seats if they're losing population or they're just not growing that fast. Some states will pick up seats if they're growing really rapidly, as we've seen in like Texas. I mean, Texas blew up over the last decade and the decade before that, actually. They picked up 4 seats in 2010, and they just picked up 2 seats this year. Florida picked up 1 seat this year as well. So, and then meanwhile, states like California lost a seat because we've talked about this before also on this podcast, there's a giant blue state exodus going on in California. So because California's losing population, they're going to lose a congressional seat. So basically, whenever the census is done every 10 years, those numbers are then sent to all the states, and then there's a formula that's used to calculate how many congressional districts each state gets. And then once that formula is done and each state is allocated their number of seats, then it's the responsibility of that state. And it depends on each state, the process that they use, and we'll get into that as well today. But each state then gets to choose how they're going to redraw their lines. And they have to redraw their lines, even if they're keeping the same number of districts, because every single district has to have the same number of people, and people shift around even within a state. So even if you're a state like, Arkansas, that didn't really pick up any seats, didn't really grow or shrink faster than the rest of the country, they still have 4 seats, just like they did in the last, cycle in 2010. They still have to redraw their lines to make sure that each district has the same number of people in it. So basically, that's what's going on. It's very technical, but it has a really massive impact for all of American politics for the next decade until, what will be the 2030 census. So what's happening now is, the thing that nerds, just geek out over, election nerds geek out over. But the general public will see the impact of it when they actually go to their ballot box and vote in November in the midterms. Because some people, if they're living in what used to be a competitive district, they might have a different member of Congress now, or they might be in a brand new district, or they might be in a district that doesn't even have an incumbent, or they might be in a district that, used to exist, last year, but got destroyed because their seat lost a congressional district. So everybody is going to be impacted in some way, with respect to who their representative is or what district they live in or what it looks like. The process of redistricting usually takes several months. The data was released to the states last year, and we're just now getting to the very end of it. It's over 40 states have finished it. Some states don't really have, much work to do because they only have a couple of seats. But the only really big states that are outstanding now are New York is the big one because the Supreme Court, the appellate court there just threw out the congressional map, and we'll talk about that today as well. Kansas, Missouri, and New Hampshire. Those are the only 4 states that are left to redistrict. And once those are done, every single state will have finished this process.
So our redistricting process here in Virginia has taken a matter of months. And I can remember that. Can you walk us through the process of start to beginning where Virginia has gone, from getting the census numbers to having maps in place?
So Virginia was interesting, and I might actually lean on Nick to explain a little bit more of this because he actually voted for some of the legislation that governed the way that we're doing it. But to give you a brief 30-second summary, Virginia, over the past few years, passed not an independent, but more like a bipartisan redistricting commission, rather than have just the legislature draw the maps like you have in some of these other states. Instead, they were going to say, we're going to set up this commission, and it's supposed to be equal representation between Republicans and Democrats. They're going to sit down and draw the maps. They're going to give it to the legislature. If the legislature doesn't like it, then it'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will draw the maps. And that's basically the process that we went through, because when the commission met, the Democrats basically were sitting there insisting that, well, we want 7 seats in a state that only has 11 electoral votes. And, Republicans naturally were not interested in doing that, because a 7-4 map is absolutely biased towards Democrats. If you really want an equal map, you would have like 5-5 and then 1 toss-up seat, or maybe 6-5 one way or the other. That'd be more equal. But there were some disputes over the way that happened, and it ended up going to the courts, and the courts picked 2 people to draw the lines. And when they finished doing that, the map became official, and we still found ourselves in the 7th district, although the 7th district no longer goes to Richmond. It's now going up to Prince William.
Well, the interesting part, kind of in the history, too, of what was going on in the Virginia General Assembly is like, look, whenever somebody's in power, nobody wants to give up the power of drawing the lines, right? And so let's just be intellectually honest about all of this. If Republicans are in power, they want to draw good lines for Republicans. If Democrats are in power, they want to draw good lines for Democrats. The real question is how much of these other kind of rules or standards do we use when we're drawing it? And you're going to see some of the congressional districts that have been drawn in other states. I mean, it's ridiculous. There is nothing to justify the way that they did it. There was clearly no other motivation other than we're trying to save a particular seat for our party. And both parties do it, right? Both parties do it.
Yes.
The idea in Virginia is that, okay, because you had a lot of people, we want an independent commission. Please hear me when I say this. There is no such thing, right? There is no such thing as an independent commission.
But what about California?
Yeah, exactly. California, where they basically a bunch of academics got together from really liberal universities and whatnot. There is no such thing as an independent commission, right? There is always going to be some degree, because either the independent commission was selected by politicians, right, or there was some other mechanism where the process can be manipulated. And so the real question is what sort of rules govern your actions? Is it an open and transparent process? And is there some sort of appeal process when something is totally egregious, right? That's about as good as you can get. And in Virginia, I don't think ours worked perfectly. I think there's still issues. But what we essentially said is we're going to be open and transparent about this process. So Republicans are going to pick some people. Democrats are going to pick some people. Courts are going to have some oversight. It's going to be a process where we take into account things like communities of interest. We take into account things like geographical boundaries that make sense. We're going to take into account local political boundaries, right? So don't split up local precincts or counties or city lines or town lines when you don't need to.
Yeah,
don't do things like that, right? So those are the sort of boundaries that we put in place. And again, the overall map that came out of Virginia, I'm not thrilled with it. I think there's some obvious things you can look at and say, okay, that's problematic. But you are not going to see in Virginia what you are seeing in some of these other states with respect to just horribly blatant gerrymandering.